Evening. This is Kenneth with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to give y'all my take on what went down today during the Minneapolis Public Schools board retreat. I'm not sure about y'all, but I was pretty surprised actually when all of a sudden there was a 300-page document thrown out online, and the boards announced that they were having a retreat, and so. I took the opportunity to clear my schedule and see if I could make it all day, which I was able to. And so today, the board had a 6-hour retreat. And even though this big document was out in public, I wasn't actually sure what what the goal of the retreat was. And I showed up to find out that it looks like Minneapolis Public Schools is embarking on a new strategic plan after several years of either not really following their strategic plan, Acceleration 2020, or just not being under the time frame of that plan any longer. Now Minneapolis Public Schools is taking the opportunity, now that the CDD has passed, to start building a new strategic plan. And so today was spent, really trying to figure out how is the board going to align around specific priorities? How are they going to, take into consideration lots of different competing things coming from community, coming from the state, coming from the federal government, around identifying priorities and making Minneapolis Public Schools work for every single student in the city. And so they started today by, just kind of sharing some context, sharing considerations. Senior Officer Moore shared, there are lots of different things that, came together in order to help inform, that can help inform what the strategic plan will look like, between world's best workforce, both the state legislation and then also the committee who has identified specific priorities. We have equity and diversity impact assessments that have tons of information. We have lots of feedback and data from the comprehensive district design work and parent participatory surveys or participatory evaluation, student participatory evaluation. And so all these things are helping inform, what are the things that Minneapolis should really be focusing on. And so the board started the conversation by identifying, different things through the document and they just feel stand out. And so that list was about 25, maybe 26 items long. And then throughout the day, the goal was to start to narrow it down. They wanted to walk out with a goal of having somewhere between 3 and 5 priorities, which they ended up having 4. And so I'll get there in a second. After they listed this long list of priorities, the board then started having a conversation about, what does public education mean? And then also trying to identify what happens when either the board's collective or a board member's individual definition of public education differs from members of the community, and getting all the pressure and the distractions was a term that was used. Like, how do we have a strategic plan that allows us to focus and acknowledge things that are real and come up and fires to put out and situations to address, but also how do we acknowledge the difference between what our work is focused on doing and what is a distraction to the work that they have prioritized. And distractions can obviously come from many different places, internally, within the district, externally, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I thought the conversation was really interesting. It was interesting to hear board members essentially kind of come together and say, I'm really excited about having a strategic plan to have us really say, these are our values. Here are the things that we consistently hear. This is what we know from our data. This is what we've collected in surveys over and over again around, what students and parents and staff want, right? And so I think that was really abundantly clear is, they want to come back to their core values. And, they're setting some of those in this process, but they've also announced them as they were running for school board and different things like that. So that was the big part of that initial conversation. And I think it got board members in a space to really kind of open up and share kind of their reflections in the need for having a strategic plan and a need to focus on all the things or on specific things because they can't focus on all of the things, right? So that was the first section. And then the second conversation was really interesting as they started to dive into how how they feel about some of the different public mandates that are provided that may limit kind of the sense of possibility of things that they want to accomplish as a board for students across Minneapolis, right? And so no specific public mandates were named, but they I think they're talking about things like how much money they get from the state and how much money they get from the federal government and how much of those dollars require specific things of them. Statewide standards, MCAs, just different things that they feel like they have to do. And how does that then conflict with some of the things that they want to be true about Minneapolis public schools? And so, that conversation, again, was really centered around being able to figure out how can we help inform folks around this is kind of the arena that we get to make decisions in versus there are other external factors that help that lead us to where we have to be or what we have to do for students. And I think that was a really important conversation as well. They were talking about some of the consequences and how they share that publicly with folks. And then also how that guides their own decision making. And ultimately, it was good to see and hear kind of the board acknowledge, yes, we have these external things that limit, how much decision making power we actually have. And also there's a whole host of things that are within our control that we have to make important decisions about. And I think, again, that was a rich conversation and kind of where they finally ended up at. And then it was just about before lunch. So as they were getting ready to go to lunch, they had the opportunity to vote on some of that initial list of 25, 26 things that they initially said and what things should be top priorities. And so if you follow us on Twitter, I listed some of those different things on Twitter. Things like well-rounded education, school climate came up, anti-racist, competent staff came up, a focus on academics in different ways, advanced academics came up, lots of different things. I was reflecting on these are definitely the things that a school district should be providing for students. I did wonder though, how much of this conversation would change if there was a time limit on them. And so if they were to say what are the things that you want to be true about Minneapolis public schools in the next 3 to 5 years, how would one, even that list change, but then two, how would people's priorities change? Because if it were me, right, I could imagine this being something that I want to be true about Minneapolis public schools for the next 100 years. I could also imagine that I want it to be true, next year, because I know it's not true right now. And so I thought that was an interesting kind of tension in how people might vote. But ultimately, we started to see not only some priorities kind of rise to the top, but we also started to see how different things were interconnected and really could be grouped and categorized. So during the lunch session, staff took the opportunity to kind of create 5 different categories that included effective staff, academics, accountability. What were the other 2? It was effective staff, accountability, academics, student well-being, and I'm forgetting the other one off the top of my head. And so I'll look that up really quickly. But basically, what we were seeing is, essentially, these were kind of the categories that the board was starting to narrow this down to. And the last one was school climate, school and district climate. And so through that process, we saw the board take an opportunity to then, after lunch, start to talk about how do we want to evaluate progress? What are the things that we want to really what do we want to see to know that whether these things are working or not? How are we going to, measure this and talk about this regularly? And so they talked about things like, ongoing ongoing contact with all of this information. So we want to get regular reports as opposed to a one-time big presentation that might feel punitive because after a year, maybe nothing has changed or some things have changed, as opposed to they want to have an opportunity to intervene as things are happening to try to change the trajectory. That was a term that was used a lot. They want to change the trajectory. They don't want to be in a punitive place. They want to be in a place where they can be supportive and, hopefully inform a different direction, or help advise on a different course to take. So that was a big thing. Lots of conversations around like testing of students and evaluating students. And so a good amount of people were talking about, growth versus proficiency. Folks were also talking about, trying to get, how do we get more qualitative along with quantitative data? And that's something that the research, evaluation, and accountability department has been doing, and board members shared that that's been helpful. There was a board member, Director Inns, that shared that a lot of the information that he has received has not been helpful in his 7 years on the board in making a decision. And so while I don't believe that to be totally true, I think it was an exaggerated point to make. The point that he was trying to make is like, I think he wants the board or the district to be intentional about the type of data and information that the board is given in order to help make decisions. Because I believe that he has used data and information in the past. I'm not sure what else he would be using. But I do think it brings up also an interesting tension that comes up, I believe, later in the conversation as they start to talk about, how they're narrowing down the priorities. But yeah, it ended up being a really good conversation. They also talk about wanting to continue to disaggregate data. The board also talked about, specifically Director Arneson shared concerns around disaggregating data by school, because it could create a situation that shames schools. Instead, like, we can have disaggregated about how we're doing as an entire district. And I think that's an interesting tension, right? Because I think you want to know like how schools are doing, how are we doing in different parts of the city, and at the same time, like, yeah, if people are internalizing like, I go to a bad school, that's hard and that's tough and that's difficult. And so I think about some of the work that AEC has been doing in terms of like, we have identified specific schools that are doing things in certain ways, but we've also identified different classes of schools or tiers of school based on like the data. Like, we know 5 schools in the district don't have teachers of color, for example, in 2020. Like, that was a big deal. Like, we should know that and address that. And if there's some type of trend amongst those 5 schools, we should know that. We know that schools in North Minneapolis have lower reading proficiencies than schools in other parts of the city, and they also have lower years of experience for teachers, right? Like, and so if we know things maybe by quadrant or regions of the city, I think that would be helpful. But I thought it was an interesting discussion, and I think is going to continue to be something important to pay attention to see if like the districts and the board actually have the information that they need in order to make equitable decisions. Because if we're just looking at the city as a whole and saying like, oh, Black students aren't learning, well, also we need to start thinking about where are Black students and what are they doing? Or like, Black students don't have specific resources, or Indigenous students don't have specific, we have issues with attendance with Indigenous students, or whatever the issue may be that they want to try to correct. So I think that'll be an interesting conversation moving forward. Then finally, they got to the point where they're like looking at these 5 things. And again, those 5 things were accountability, or academics, student well-being, climate, and again, I'm missing the 5th one. But what ended up coming out is they actually ended up removing effective staff was the last one. I apologize. So effective staff, advanced academics, accountability, student well-being, and climate, and school and district culture and climate. And they ended up removing accountability because they thought, just like equity, accountability should be a value and a process that is expected throughout. And it was also really interesting. They started having a conversation about like effective educators, and part of that was anti-racist and competent staff. But then they're saying like, oh, well, there are certain things that we want to be true about our, like, the type of education that we're providing. And so they ended up saying, well, like, if we want equity throughout, we can also put equity in our vision statement around every student receiving a well-rounded education for the strategic plan. And so they ended up saying a well-rounded and equitable education, and so I thought that was an interesting reflection. I probably would have kept, if I could have said something and I was dying to say stuff all day long, I probably would have said, I think we should keep accountability, because I think if we're looking at, again, the next 3 to 5 years, I think we actually really need to strengthen and solidify our systems of accountability. So everybody in our buildings across the district knows what's expected of them, and also knows like what they're being measured on and how they can get support. And I think, there's been varying degrees based on like shifting board values, shifting priorities and implementation, that I don't think that system of accountability really exists. And so I actually would love to see accountability um, be its own section. But the board didn't go there, and I can understand why. Like they think that these are four things: again, academics, effective staff, student well-being, and school and district climate. These are four things that we want to strive to aspirationally, and like we should have accountability baked within each of these. So that is where the conversation took its course today. And so next steps to be looking forward to are the district leadership, superintendent and his staff will be trying to develop a work plan based on today's conversations and the kind of the goals that the district has set out, and then or the board has set out. And so that should be presented to the school board at the September committee of the whole meeting, which I think will be an important and an interesting conversation. I don't think they'll be in a place to say like, yeah, this is exactly what we want. I think this is the start of a broader conversation about building out goals around a strategic plan. So stay tuned for that. I think that'll be an important conversation for folks to really tune in on, because this is going to be kind of the direction of our district for the next several years. And so this is an opportunity to weigh in, to say like, this is what I think, and to share that with your board representatives. And so we haven't done this in a long time, and it feels weird doing it without Heather, but I'm going to try. I would say today there are some really interesting reflections for me for our most valuable moment and our do better moment. And so I'll start with the most valuable moment. The most valuable moment I thought was to be in person with the school board members and see and hear and develop the conversation, or see how the conversation was developing in real time and in person. Just having that accessibility, knowing that people are paying attention for them, and you can see again the whites of people's eyes, I think was really, really important. And also I would say it was important for them relationally, right? Like I was reflecting with one of the board members as during a break. I think the board is in a much better relational place than it has been in the past, and you could see that in the way that they were talking through things, bringing up tensions, bringing up concerns, listening and considering things. Like it didn't feel like there was a lot of political posturing. It didn't feel like there was a lot of agendas being driven. It felt like an open and honest conversation. So I'd say that was a positive. And also another, I'll give them credit for this most valuable moment, was also there's a good part of the conversation always stayed focused on academics. People kept bringing back the fact that we need to get better academically. I know Director Cerrillo specifically was asking about academic excellence versus just a well-rounded education. I know Director Pauly was talking about like, we need to do a better job of defining these things. What does a well-rounded education mean? What does social and emotional learning mean? What does, all of these things, like there was a real push to clarify for the community and also to make their declaration clear so that people could hold them accountable. So I thought that was those are positive moments throughout today. I did think a do better moment. Again, I'll say if I had a vote, which I don't, but if I had a vote on the board, I think accountability would have been something that I would have included as a priority. I also would have considered state-of-the-art facilities for students. I was surprised that didn't even come up as a consideration. I would also maybe considered really looking at data-driven decisions. And I think, this is related to my second do better moment with Director Inns. Again, I truly, truly do believe that Director Inns uses the information that the school district provides in order to make his decisions. That being said, I do think there's like a balance there around like identifying data that affirms the decision that aligns with your values, as opposed to making data-driven decisions. And it doesn't mean that our values need to come in tension with the data, but it does mean like the information that is brought to us, like we need to be intentional about understanding how we can utilize that data in order to make strong decisions that align with our values. And so, my do better moment, I guess, will go to Director Inns for maybe misspeaking, but also I think it leads to a broader conversation around like how are we utilizing the information that we have to make strategic decisions around like how we can better support students across this district. So with that, you got a little taste of everything. It was a long 6-hour meeting. It's a 300-page document. It's posted online. I mean, I guess you can read it if you want. But that is where the board landed today with these 4 priorities moving ahead. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.